Hi everyone, Paul here, and in this video I'm going to take you through some of the stuff that you can do with the new Eevee Manga Shader version 3. And so I'm going to show you how to get it, how to apply it to a scene, and what kind of effects you can expect to create using this particular shader. So without any further ado, let's jump in and let's get started. So let's begin with downloading and installing. You go over to the Gumroad page, you go, I want this, you put in your email address and you go get. Then what happens is that you will unpack a blend file which looks something like this. Now this is just a demo file with a demo model, and in it it's got a few demo materials that I've created, including one which is labeled Eevee-MS3, and in that one there is just the nodes that make up parts of this shader that you can then make node trees out of for your own sets of materials. Here is just a test file with this monkey head. It's got a basic material that comes preloaded when you create a new file. I've also got a floor object, which I'm just going to hide for the moment, and we're just going to focus in on this monkey head. What you want to do is you want to append the material that we just downloaded. So I'm just going to navigate to where I've saved the file, click on the file that I downloaded, and there's two ways that you can import this material. You can either double click on the materials folder and select the Eevee-MS v3 material, or alternatively, you can just go to node tree and select these nodes, the TOON base, the sketch lines, and halftone nodes, all right? And so this will just import the nodes and not the material, which is just fine. And you'll see these other ones, but they will import automatically after you import these because they actually make up part of those node trees. So I'm just going to go do it this way so that we don't get an extra material created. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this principled BSDF shader, and I'm going to Shift A, add a new group. And in this case, it's going to be the TOON base shader. So I've gone and added the Eevee TOON base underscore v3 node group, which is basically the heart of this shader, and I've applied it to both the monkey head and the plane, and I've gone and added this sun lamp to create some shadow information. So we can do things like rotate this sun lamp around, and you'll see that these shadows interact quite nicely with this material, including casting a shadow, which is really, really nice. Now this sun has just got a strength of 10. The shadows have been enabled, which I can disable, but let's enable them because we really, really want shadows here. And now we're going to take a look at some of the controls inside of the Eevee TOON base shading node group. Now by default the color is gray, nothing too exciting, and clearly if you click on that color you get a swatch and you can create any sort of color that you want. You can also desaturate that color or have any sort of level of saturation that you want. By default it's set to 1. Now, the next ones are your shadow size and shadow intensity. The shadow intensity basically gives you the intensity of the shadow cast, and that includes shadows that are cast by lamps, so that you can get that to 1, or you can have no shadow intensity at all, or somewhere in between. Now, the shadow size, of course, goes hand in hand with that, where you can sort of creep that up or back, and depending on the strength of your light, this shadow size can be quite minimal in change, or a lot more stark. So for instance, if we had a sun lamp that was, I don't know, just a lower strength, you can sort of see how that shadow size, by creeping that back, you can have a very dark shadow or a very light shadow, but it sort of goes hand in hand with how much light you're getting in that scene. So I'm just going to keep this at a fairly low setting because then we can worry about the softness here. Now by softening the shadow, you can get these nice sort of soft toon effects around the edges there, okay, so by intensifying that shadow. Now I skipped over this thing called metalness because that sort of goes hand in hand with this shadow, right? So if we increase what's known as the metalness, it seems to increase the shadow creep, but what it actually does is it makes things look a little bit more metallic, okay? So you get sharper shadows even if this softness is really, really pumped up, okay? And the other thing here is this light factor. So where does this factor in? Well, let's give this lamp a light color. So let's say it's a sort of a purpley color. Okay, we won't make it too intense, but we'll give it this purple color. And then we want to increase the light factor. You can actually get the light to dictate the color of the surface. But sometimes you want lights to only give a little bit of their coloring to the surface, okay? But you still want these nice TOON effects. And so there's a really lovely metallic sheen there with a nice sort of metalness there. It's getting some nice highlights there as well. We've got a nice shadow size, which you can probably creep back a little bit, and a nice sort of intense shadow. And finally, we've got these rim settings. By default, we've got a little bit of a rim glow around it, but we can sort of bump those right back to 0 to see how this works. So if I was to say have no intensity on the rim, but begin to creep this rim up, you'll actually notice that you get somewhat of a rim effect. That's because the rim is plugged into the shadows so that it actually etches away at the shadows on the back side of the object. And so when we go around, you can see we get this nice little sort of Fresnel effect that makes it look kind of glossy. And then the rim intensity makes that rim really, really intense. And of course, we can change the color of that rim to whatever we want. So if we want to sort of simulate this kind of backlighting, we can certainly do that to get some really nice TOON effects, okay? And so that's basically the effects that you've got in the TOON-based shader. Now, you'll have noticed that there's a bunch of outputs as well, and I'm just going to quickly show you these. Yes. And I'm going to use the node wrangler here to switch between them. All right, so the node wrangler is a really interesting system which allows us to change our outputs with a touch of a button. So I'm just going to hold down Control, Shift, and click on the Eevee TOON-based shader whenever I want to switch the output. So let's just go click. And so this is the color output. What the information that we're seeing here is a combination of, say, the light factor here, the actual color, and any other color information that we have. So, you know, the light factor could actually constitute a color pass. Control Shift, shadow out, and what we're getting here is just this grayscale of only the shading information. Of course, you can see that the rim light is there, but what you'll notice is that it isn't intense and it hasn't got that coloring because it's really just taking a look at the rim light. Now, this is sort of important when you want to composite some of these outputs together because you don't want the rim light to sort of overlap in an ugly sort of a way in this area. You sort of want to overlap it over the base color. And finally, Control Shift click, we have the rim. And that is obviously the rim color is present, but you can see that it's got this completely black area where there is no rim light. You know, you can even have the intensity show up. And so by putting this over, say, something like a color output or something like that with an add function, you can further control the rim light. Now, I put these in so you can sort of mix and match these parts of the TOON-based shader and create even further subtle effects using this system. Now, the next thing I want to show you is the two textures that I've added to this particular release. So let's start with the halftone shader, which is something that a lot of people love to use, especially to get sort of manga style effects. Now, the best way to show the halftone shader is, okay, let's just start with the color output here. So you'll see that all of a sudden we've got this lovely halftone pattern covering our TOON base render. And now we've got these extra controls to control the dots over here. The first one is the dot ratio, and by dot ratio it means how densely packed those dots are. And so a dot ratio that's very, very low is going to have lots of dots smacking up against each other very, very tightly, whereas a very loose ratio, wherever the pattern requires it, they're very far apart. They're smaller dots within the square which they occupy on the tile. To further illustrate this, you can just drop down the scale and you can already see how the dots have a little bit of spacing, but where it's a lot lighter shading, you can see how the dots are very, very small because the color input is actually driving the size of those dots, and the dot ratio is sort of responding to that. Furthermore, we've got this rotation, so we can actually rotate that map around to any angle that you want to get that kind of half-tone pattern looking really nice. Okay, so you can have like this straight square pattern. You can have 30 degrees or 60 degrees or just 45 degrees, which is fine. I'll just skip the invert for a second, but the saturation means that you can basically overlay the halftone saturation over the color input, so you can have those colors showing through, and the halftone will just be desaturated over the top, so you can get a very light halftone effect if you really, really wanted to, just to give it a slight patterning to give that nice comic book feel. And finally, we've got this invert, and what the invert does is it inverts the dots so that the lighter areas will have the bigger dots and the darker areas will have the smaller dots. And so if you actually have a shadow intensity of 1, you can get this effect, right? And this is going to come in handy when I'm going to show you how to mix the two shaders, the two textures together to get this kind of Spider-Verse look, which a lot of people are wanting to produce these days. All right, so that's pretty much the halftone shader. Let's hop on over to the sketch lines shader. We will connect out the combined output into the color so we can see how this all functions. Okay, so these sketch lines are pretty intense, so I'm just going to drop down the line frequency to something we can see, maybe even a 5, just to make it really, really stark. I mean, no one's really going to use this sort of line work. We're probably going to be bumping it up to a 10 or something like that. But for the purposes of working with this particular texture, I'm just going to bring it right down so we can see what's going on. Again, it keys off the shadows and the basically the luminescence or the brightness of the surface before applying this. Well, it's basically just a wave texture, but you'll notice that things like the edges erode, and so where it's actually going to lighter areas, the line work sort of tapers off to these nice little points, which sort of gives this nice effect that someone's stroked these lines across, maybe with a ruler, but they're sort of thinning out. If you have this shadow soften right up, you can really bump up this tapering effect as well. But let's take a look at the sketch line controls. Again, we've got this line frequency, which just basically means how tightly packed those lines are or how frequent they are across the surface. The line thickness, we can have very, very thin lines or very, very fat lines, with these really thick tapered edges, these sort of nice blobby inking effects if we wanted. Again, we can rotate those lines around, okay, so we can get various angles out of this. Then there's this line creep factor, which just basically means that these lines can creep in from the shadow areas into the more well-lit areas to give a starker effect, or a less stark effect to let the brighter areas sort of shine through. And again, this saturation means that it saturates over the top of the TOON base material. All right, so that's pretty much the sketch lines. So now, why don't we combine some of these node groups to create a really interesting effect? And this is where the outputs of this node group become very, very powerful. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the shadow out to dictate the sketch lines and halftone areas, and then we're going to combine it with the color out to get our final effect. So we'll leave these settings as they are with a bit of metalness, a bit of light factor, etc., etc. But what we're going to do is, first off, we're going to run the shadow output through the sketch lines filter, and already you can see that these sketch lines here. Now, if we were to bring in just a conventional mix RGB, run the color into the first input, and the sketch lines into the second input, and set that to multiply, now we can sort of multiply those lines over the top of that color. But we can also, change it to, say, like an overlay to get a different sort of line effect that sort of takes a bit of that color information. Next, what we want to do is bring in this halftone, but we want to set this to invert. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the shadow output information. And if we were to see what this looks like on an inverted plane, you can see that the highlights are really what stand out here. I'm just going to bring this scale right back to something like 20. Our shadow intensity we're going to bring right up to 1 for the purposes of knocking out this black area over the top of these sketch lines so that we won't really have any dots in where the sketch lines are going to sit, which is in the darker areas. And now what we want to do is, I'm just going to duplicate this, I'm going to set this to add, and I'm going to bring in the first sum total of that into the first operation, this into the second operation, and then we're going to see what all of this looks like by adding in that halftone texture. And now we can start to see how the halftone only exists in the highlighted areas, the sketch lines only exist in the shaded areas, okay? And we're starting to get that kind of Spider-Verse feel. And so to really make this obvious, what we need to do is bring back that line creep as far back as we can. Maybe we decrease the shadow size a little bit, increase the dot ratio a little there, maybe desaturate it a little. But already you can sort of see how we're getting that effect, okay? And because that color information is working with the lamp color, now we can do some very interesting things, okay? So before we get into rim lighting, what we're going to do, I'm going to turn this into a point light. Okay, so bring this over here, and I'm going to duplicate it a couple of times. This point light, let's make this a nice kind of a mauvey light. Let's make this key light somewhat of maybe a yellowy orange light, and this one here, something greenish. We'll have to increase the strength of these lamps. And now maybe if we sort of move these lights closer, okay, like so, you can see how these lights now affect the surface, especially if we increase the light factor. Okay, maybe we drop down this. Oh no, we sort of have to increase this metal sheen, and we definitely have to increase the shadow size. But you can sort of see where they're affecting the floor surface. Maybe if we increase the radius a little bit. Yeah, increasing the radius sort of softens out the effect of the point light somewhat. So you can definitely play around with the light settings a little bit. Maybe drop down their luminosity to something a little bit more manageable. But let's make this a little bit darker, maybe a bit more bluish. And you can already see how that light factor is really affecting that stuff. Now, maybe if we bring down the shadow intensity, we'll start to get some of those dots in. And again, you sort of want to play around with all of this. And finally, sort of bringing in some of that rim light there, we can etch away parts of that, but we can also, say we duplicate this, add over here, add in our rim light with some coloring there for the final completed effect. And so there you can sort of see how, okay, it's a bit messy and you sort of want to neaten those up a lot. If you really wanted to, you can sort of have this color out as your basis. And this would make it much starker because the shadow output and the rim output will sort of overlay onto these things because, the shadow intensity is there quite black. And that's why, if you use the color output, that shadow information won't conflict with the really intense shading that gives us this sort of texturing pattern. you can see how this shader can create some really nice effects by combining all of the parts that TOON shader for Eevee. Now finally, I'm going to show you how to combine the Eevee TOON-based shader to get effects such as, TOON type glass. Okay, and this is an effect that can really be quite special because we've got these lovely reflective looking surfaces that look very comic or TOON shaded. But to have a little bit of transparency there, this will suddenly look like comic rendered glass. Now you've got to do a couple of things to set this up in Eevee. The first thing you have to do is in your render properties, make sure that screen space reflections is enabled. I'd also recommend under the film setting to make sure that transparency is set so that if you have a transparent background when you're in rendered mode, the transparency will show through and any backgrounds that you composite underneath this render are also going to show through, and that's really, really important for a good composite. Okay, so I'm just going to have this on rendered mode with scene and scene lights enabled. The other thing you have to do is under materials, you have to scroll down to settings and under blend mode, set this to one of these alpha. I generally use alpha blend. Let's set a glass material up. How do we do that? Well, first off, we need a transparent BDSF. What we also need, okay, you'll notice that I've removed that viewer there because this is going to sort of mess things up. You want to go straight to the material output. You need a shader mix shader. And what we want to do is we want to mix the output of this shader that we've created, which is nice and glossy, with the transparent BSDF, so that we can now control how opaque or transparent that glass is. And that's pretty much it. And so you can see that by having no show back face, we don't actually see the back side of that. So if you want a sort of a crystal ball, enable the show back face. And with a bit of back face culling, you actually get a little bit more of a better effect, really. But you can sort of play around with that to sort of ask yourself, what kind of glass effect do you want? Do you want something that's just a little bit transparent with this sort of glossy material over the surface? Or do you want something that sees right through the entire volume of that glassy material? And that's pretty much it. If you wanted something that was a little bit more realistic, you can do things like run the shadow out into the transparency, and that will assign where the transparency is, more transparent, less transparent, based on the shadows, right? So you can sort of see how that sort of works. You can have shadow intensity right down, or if you have it quite high, you can have sort of a darker glass type of thing. And that's sort of the thing that you can really go to town with when working with these other outputs. And that's how you would get these sorts of comic style glass effects. So that's pretty much it for showing you how this TOON shader works, some of the things you can do with it, and now it's really up to you to go to town. Now, if you want to sort of see what some of these demo materials look like, you can just open up the demo file and take a look at how I've set up, say, the glass material for this transparent windshield, or the chassis with its sketch lines and halftone, and how I've applied that. And so you can sort of see how all of that's set up for a little bit of inspiration. But I do highly encourage you to just go to town with the combinations for your own materials and create your own effects from scratch using the node groups that I've supplied.